And we'll go. So we're going to start here on the fourth, yeah, the fourth edition of The Doctor Is In, and we are now recording, and we are live. I'm so excited. We've got Elizabeth. We've got Elizabeth in Australia, and we've got Dan in Western Canada, which is pretty amazing. And so I think most of you have been on one of these before, so I talk for about 15, 20 minutes-ish, and then it's your time for questions. And as a reminder, your question does not have to be related to the topic of the day. And then when it comes time for questions, you can unmute yourself, of course, or you can put a question in the chat box. It's also helpful if you turn on your video, but it's not necessary. And I'll later in my talk, I'll post the references that I'll be referring to during this talk. So in the previous webinar, we discussed the linkages between adverse childhood experiences and changes in the brain and body and how that impacts child development, which then leads to greater risk of victimization and perpetration. The topic is rather complicated and heavy. And I had a lot of good questions after the talk, but I thought I'd be a little bit more positive this week and spend time on resilience and recovery. So our brains have a certain amount of plasticity throughout our lives, and that makes them vulnerable to negative environmental influences, but it also makes them resilient and open to positive influences, which is what I'll be discussing today. So McEwen states that a healthy brain architecture provides the basis for good self-esteem and a locus of control for effective self-regulation. This is not only of behavior, but also of the physiologic responses to stressors that are regulated by the central as well as peripheral nervous systems. So that's the foundation of resilience. Like trauma, it resides in our brain and our bodies and not necessarily in the events we experience. And so what is important to understand is that we are designed to adapt to our environment, whether it's positive and encouraging or negative and harmful. And in this way, people who have survived horrific trauma in their past now struggle with behaviors that kept them alive during that time, but now are maladaptive in their new and safe environment. So we can say that the survivors are resilient and they are strong people because they've adapted to their dangerous and threatening environment and survived. So I'm going to show a slide here that's really pertinent. It says, by Bessel van der Kolk, says, if you feel safe and loved, your brain becomes specialized in exploration and play and cooperation. But if you're frightened and unwanted, it specializes in managing feelings of fear and in abandonment. That's from van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. And so I just want to emphasize that because our brain is plastic and malleable, it adapts to our environment. And so what do we mean by resilience? And so most people think of resilience as having a positive outcome after adversity. There's also post-traumatic growth, which is positive development and even thriving in the aftermath of traumatic experiences, and that the stress itself is the catalyst for these changes. Resilience is also protective to the effects of trauma when coping mechanisms are operating at the time of the event. So resilience doesn't mean that our brains revert to the way that they were or would have been had there been no trauma. The neural connections, as well as some of the architecture of the brain, has been altered, even if the function seems to be normal. This is an example of our brain's amazing plasticity and adaptability. No matter what kind of physical or psychological trauma we experience, there are always marks, and the events are part of our story. Our behaviors may have recovered from their maladaptive patterns, but some of the gene expressions may have not. The scientific literature describes neurobiological factors that appear to influence resilience, such as genetic and epigenetic factors that we discussed in our last webinar, the neurochemical systems, and the connectivity of specific neural networks. As with the consequences of trauma, the mechanisms that build resilience are also complex and are influenced by a variety of internal and external individual characteristics. And we are only beginning to understand these interactions on a neurobiological level. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of that neurobiochemistry as much as I did last time, but suffice to say that the brain is the central organ of stress and adaptation to stressors because it perceives what is potentially threatening and determines the behavioral and physiological responses. So Levine states that trauma resides in the nervous system and not in the event itself. And so I'll say that again, the trauma is individual and it's not necessarily this in the event. So how you and your nervous system responds to the traumatic stress determines the trauma symptoms. This is part of the reason why different people who experience the same event have different symptoms and responses to that event. So I'm going to share another slide here that describes a cycle by Levine, a cycle of responses. So let me go share here. And, oh, is it going? There we go. So Levine here describes, so this is a normal process. This is how our bodies react to trauma or a stressful event. So we have chemical or hormonal processes that activate that fight, flight, or freeze response. And then we have a protection, orientation, and defense activities like protecting ourselves, running away, or shouting, or doing something that helps us stay safe, even if it works or not. That's what our natural bodies do. And then we discharge the excess activation. We've got a whole bunch of sympathetic charge going on. We've got to discharge that by talking with someone, relating someone, debriefing. A lot of it has to do with social, but a lot of it has to do with some physical activities. And then we return to our relaxed alertness or physiological homeostasis. We return to baseline. And so that when this cycle is disrupted, then the likelihood of suffering traumatic symptoms is greater. That some people experience terrifying events and yet come out relatively unscathed has to do with their present resilience factors. Factors such as having stable attachment relationships and people with whom to process an event. Another is their ability to regulate themselves and their emotions such that they are able to keep their head. That is, they can maintain connection to their frontal lobes that handle executive functions in the face of fear and adversity. So here's a story to help narrate this concept. A few years ago, I was trail running alone in Colorado, and as I came down a pass, there was a huge flock of sheep being guarded by a couple of Great Pyrenees, you know, those great, huge sheep herder dogs. I didn't know what to do, so I just slowed through a walk to go through. I mean, the flock was ginormous. The dogs would have none of that. They came up and barked and snagged my clothes and tore through my legs, and I thought I was going to be mauled or perhaps killed. But for some reason, I didn't scream, even though I wanted to. I didn't run. I just kept praying to Jesus that he would call his dogs off. And my legs didn't get ripped to shreds, fortunately. I just stood there and then sat down, and finally they relented, but they stayed very near me. And I sat down and waited. And they watched me until they walked away and the sheep followed him. I got down to where I had some friends waiting, and then we went to the emergency clinic, and when I got back to their house, I wasn't even afraid of their golden Labrador. And even to this day, I can tell that story where I might have been killed without having such a sympathetic response. My heart rate doesn't go up. I don't start sweating when I'm telling about it. And so that's what I mean by being able to have some resilience or coping mechanisms in the midst of a stressful event. But that doesn't happen to everyone. And so resilience in the context of trauma is as much a matter of the state of the person prior to trauma as it is in post-traumatic recovery. Early life experiences play a key role in the development of the child and either nurture or hinder the development across the various domains, such as cognitive, physical, emotional, and social development. These experiences have impacts that are felt throughout the lifespan. The amount, as well as the consistency of care given in early life, are important in facilitating positive resilience factors. In this way, ACEs, or lack of them, can make a big difference in post-traumatic recovery. When I consider some of the stories of survivors who are now leaders in anti-trafficking work, I wonder if a more robust early childhood helped them through the trafficking experience and facilitated their post-traumatic growth. This contrasts with many women who suffered a lot of childhood adversity prior to being trafficked and have a tougher post-traumatic healing journey. It's as if they have a deeper hole to climb out of. I'm painting with a broad brush here, and it's only a hypothesis based on my experience in reading, but it would be great to have some studies to back this up. So cultivating resilience prior to trauma is important. Nobody can predict what will happen to us, but adversity is a part of life. And these practices can be taught to young children as well as incorporated through adulthood. Now, all of these are necessary, but focusing on your stronger factors can help shore up the weaker ones. So I'm just going to show another slide that has a list of, share this one. Has a list of, let's go. And doesn't want to go. Why not? There we go. So one of the studies that I'll post a link to is psychosocial factors that promote resilience. Now, these are things that we can learn to do before, but they're also things that we can work with survivors on. And they list optimism, which is maintenance of positive expectancies for important future outcomes. I mean, what is your outlook? People have hopes and dreams. We need to tap into that. No matter how bad of an experience you've had, there's usually some kind of hope, something they're looking forward to, and it's important to tap into that and use that as a strength. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to appraise a perception or adjust a perception and experience of a traumatic situation instead of being rigid in one's perception. So active coping skills, such as identifying and utilizing your character strengths. Like when I was with the dogs, I was saying, okay, I'm really not gonna die here. Maybe that was optimism too. But trying to think, don't scream and don't run. That will make it worse. And then in that way, I was able to stay a little bit more calm to keep my brain online and not totally freak out. Maintaining a supportive social network and having good role models. So when I was able to see my friends again, then I was able to relate the experience. I was then able to finally cry. I was then able to release the stress of what I was feeling in the presence of people who cared and could help. Attending to one's physical well-being. I mean, this is so important. I mean, there's so many studies that long-term voluntary exercise is proven to help boost mood, facilitate better sleep, improve cognition, decrease depression, decrease impulsivity, regulate anxiety, and increases your ability to assess and adapt to new environments. Also, sleep is very important. Sleep, physical well-being also relates to sleep. So it's not just exercise. So sleep is medicine. And then finally, 6, embracing a personal moral compass or spirituality or faith, holding on to a set of core beliefs that are positive about oneself and one's role in the world. It really seems obvious, but spirituality and faith have been shown to facilitate post-traumatic growth. And there's been studies that show the role of positive religious factors in post-traumatic growth. However, negative religious experiences can also hinder recovery. And so it's important to address, but not push, spiritual background when working with a traumatized person. A gentle inquiry to open the door is better than ignoring a potentially important feature of someone's life. There's a growing body of literature that cites forgiveness of oneself as well as others as an identifiable component of healing. So these are all factors. One could do a whole webinar on each one of these. I'll stop sharing and going on. So in preparation for this webinar, I ran across several studies that looked at working with former child soldiers. And so we've got some important lessons from those studies, in that many youths recruited into soldiering come from broken and or violent families and did not have positive attachment figures as young children. So Kerig states, reintegration for these youth, therefore, does not involve the return to normalcy, but rather the more difficult challenge of establishing a network of positive relationships where they had been previously absent, and, moreover, doing so in the face of the stigma associated with their status as former child combatants. So, I mean, these child soldiers face stigma when they come back to their communities, as well as the trauma from having to be forced as child soldiers. So they go on to say that young men returning from their home communities were able to heal partly through going through certain developmental stages of socialization, such as marriage, fatherhood, and holding steady income. Kerig goes on and says that the sense that despite their paths, they were accepted by their communities emerged as a particularly significant theme in their recovery. So it was important that when communities no longer held their stigma against them, that it made sense that their recovery was enhanced by that. And so this was facilitated by their participation in traditional cultural cleansing ceremonies, again, the spiritual. And what the respondents cast off was not their memories of their experience, but the shame associated with them. I mean, so much of talking about trauma and recovery has to do not just with the trauma, but the shame associated with that trauma and what has been done to them. And so the men were recognized for who they are and not for what they had been forced to do. And that played a huge role in their integration and recovery. And so I'm going to go back and share another slide with some take-home messages. So let's see if we can get that going. I don't know why it continues to, oh, come on, people. Let's go. Okay. So take-home messages. If you have worked with one trauma survivor, you have worked with one trauma survivor, or met one, or have got to know one. This goes back to the individual circumstances of what brain do they have with them when they're being traumatized or in a stressful situation. What has gone into their brain architecture, and what are the external environment that that person is experiencing. Oh, sorry about that. The recovery process induces new changes in our epigenome, in our brain connections and architecture. So the trauma is reforming the brain, but in recovery, we go back and form new connections, not necessarily back the way it was, but ones that are adaptive to a new and safer environment. So number 2 is that safe relationships are key. What does it mean to be a safe person? Well, consistency and clarity are 2 big concepts in safety, but this is a whole other webinar about trauma-informed care. Another point, our brains remain malleable throughout our lives. They are, of course, more malleable as children and young adults, but there's no time at which they are set in stone like we used to believe. Adults may have to learn things such as self-soothing and trusting people in a safe relationship that most of us learn as little children. And therefore, in the recovery process, we need to extend more grace and patience to people who may struggle in areas that seem, well, rather basic. But people are learning and they are growing. We need to understand that the connections between the brain and body mean that psychological issues have physiological manifestations, and that physiological or physical activities impact our psychological well-being. So physical activity is very, very important. And I said sleep is medicine. Getting your cognitive brain more online is also important. Improving and increasing connections with your frontal lobe. Instead of reacting, trying to slow down the process and engaging your frontal lobe. This takes more time than an emotional reaction. And that requires many, many baby steps for rewiring and reconnecting. But there are many tools and practices that someone can use to maintain a sense of self in the present when faced with new or frightening situations, whether it's pre-trauma, during trauma, or post-trauma. And healing happens when we are no longer identified by our trauma. And so it's important to know that people are already strong and resilient. We don't need to treat survivors as weak people who need their hand held constantly. It's important to recognize that there are strengths and that we approach them from a strength-based message instead of just the negative trauma-based message that we kind of used to do. So these are a short list of general good, basically self-care, resilience building practices. They're definitely easier said than done. As they say, habits are hard to break, but once you have them, that you have them. So thanks for listening. Now, I'm going to stop recording and it's time for your questions.